before it had a name. There's a name buried in the early history of the Crips that almost everyone gets wrong. They hear Bonnie and assume she was just another girlfriend, another face in the background of a movement built by men, a side character in a story that wasn't hers. But that's not what happened. Because in 1971, while the Crips were still forming, while names like Tookie and Raymond were just beginning to carry weight, a teenage girl walked into a garage on 106th Street, gathered a group of girls around her and built something of her own. And in doing that, she didn't just join one of the most dangerous street movements in Los Angeles history, she changed who it belonged to. That is the story most people have never been told. To understand it, you have to go back further than 1971. You have to go back to the city that made 1971 possible. By the late 1960s, South Central Los Angeles was a neighborhood under sustained institutional collapse. The Great Migration had brought black families westward for decades, from Louisiana, from Oklahoma, from Texas, chasing the same thing everyone who came to California chased: a better life, a bigger house, wider air. Bonnie Quarles' own parents were part of that current. Her mother had come from Cherryport, Louisiana. Her father was from Wright City, Oklahoma. They landed first in East LA on 23rd Street, moved through the Dogtown projects at Aliso Village, and eventually settled in Watts in the Imperial Courts housing development, where Bonnie was born in 1956. Imperial Courts in those years was a different world than what it would become. Bonnie remembers it with the kind of specificity that only childhood memory carries. The playground, the gym, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the way the whole project felt self-contained and almost safe. Parents could stand in a doorway, whistle when the street lights came on, and trust that their kids were somewhere in the radius of that courtyard. The streets were not yet at war. The gangs that existed operated on an older logic: territory and fists, not guns and death counts. Bonnie's oldest brother caught a murder charge even then, but 7 years later he was paroled and never went back. That was a different era's arithmetic. The family moved to the west side around 1968-1969 when Bonnie was about 12. They landed on 109th Street near Normandy, a big house with a back unit attached, a living room large enough to feel like an upgrade. Bonnie describes it as a Jefferson's moment, moving on up. The projects exchanged for something that felt like actual residential life. The block was quiet. There were still a few white families on the west side of Normandy. There were older ladies and regular families and a general hush that the courts had never had. It did not feel like a place where anything catastrophic was coming, but the catastrophe was already in the house. Not the violence that would come later, the drugs that arrived first. Bonnie's older sisters were heroin addicts. As a child, she watched them overdose in their own living room. She remembers seeing milk injected into a sister's veins to counteract a hit gone wrong. She remembers it with the flat precision of someone who saw it too young and too often to dramatize it anymore. That was the texture of the childhood underneath the surface calm of 109th Street. A mother doing day work as a housekeeper in Hollywood, a father working at Arrow Chevrolet, 9 children in a household where at least 2 of the older ones had already been claimed by the needle. When you understand that, you understand why. When Bonnie got to middle school and someone introduced her to pills and weed, in the social world that orbited those things, the street did not feel like a fall. It felt like a continuation. She started at Henry Clay Junior High, then Washington High School for 10th grade in 1970. She was selling pills at school by then. Her older sister would stuff them into a hole in the wall at home, and Bonnie would retrieve them in the morning and move them during the day. She was not yet connected to any gang. What she was connected to was a rotating cast of neighborhood boys who would become foundational figures in the early Crips. Warlock, Melvin Hardy, Donald Moody, Blackie, Monkey Man, Buddha. These were not yet gang members in any formal sense. They were just friends, the circle she ran with, the people who occupied the same block-level social world she did, but underneath that casual surface, something was organizing itself. She just did not know it yet. The most important place in her daily life during this period was not school. It was 102nd Street, Blackie's house. Every morning, Bonnie would leave home supposedly heading for the bus to Fremont. She had been kicked out of Washington by this point, pills catching up with her, and instead she would hit Vermont, turn left, and walk straight to that address. Blackie's mother worked at a bank on Manchester. His stepfather, Fleet, was at work. His sister Monica was gone. The house was immaculate, somehow always immaculate, which made it stranger that every morning a rotating group of teenagers colonized it from 7 o'clock until school let out, sniffing contact cement glue and eating cupcakes in couples, laughing through whatever rush the fumes delivered. Blackie was quiet, Bonnie says, mean to everyone but her. They had the easy intimacy of 2 people who found in each other something the world around them was not offering. Stability maybe, or just predictability. He would call the night before and tell her which girls to bring. She brought them. It was protection wrapped in routine. This was the world Bonnie Quarles inhabited at the exact moment everything around her was about to catch fire. The environment that built her. There is a question that nobody who studies this period asks directly enough. What did it actually feel like to be a teenage girl in South Central in 1970, standing close enough to a rising street movement to feel its heat, but categorically excluded from its mythology? What did it feel like to know Blackie, Buddha, Monkey Man, Warlock? To spend more time with those boys than with your own brother, in Bonnie's words. And yet to be invisible in the story those boys were beginning to tell about themselves. The answer's buried in the details of Bonnie's daily life during that period, and it matters more than most historians have bothered to notice. At Fremont High School, after being kicked out of Washington, Bonnie's academic attendance was essentially fictional. She had never really been inside the school long enough to remember what it looked like. What she remembers is the corner, the route, the left turn at Vermont, the walk to 102nd. What she remembers is the chemical spin of contact cement cutting through the morning and the way the hours dissolved inside that house until it was safe to go home again. She was not stupid. She was bored and understimulated by institutions that had no particular interest in her, and the street offered at least the texture of life. Real relationships, real risk, real pleasure, real danger. The boys she knew were already organizing around an informal code of loyalty and territory, even if they did not yet call it anything. Donald Moody and the Moodies, Warlock, Melvin Hardy, all of them at Henry Clay together. All of them eventually folding into a group that would call itself the Smacks before that dissolved into something larger. Bonnie knew every one of them, but she did not know they were calling themselves the Smacks at the time, she says, because she was too busy selling them pills to pay attention to what they were calling themselves organizationally. That detail is important. It marks the exact boundary of her inclusion. She was socially present everywhere, but institutionally visible nowhere. The character who connects both sides of the story, the street world Bonnie already inhabited and the world she was about to enter, is a boy named Buddha. Buddha lived on 105th between Normandy and Butland. He was spoiled, dressed well, had an arrogance about him that Bonnie remembers affectionately and critically at the same time. She had known Buddha since before any of this began, because his brother and her brother were best friends. That's how deep the neighborhood roots ran. When Buddha later got close to Tookie, Bonnie says he changed, got snobby. The arrogance calcified into something less charming. But in those early days, Buddha was just another piece of the block, part of the loose constellation of young men Bonnie moved through daily. Monkey Man, real name William, she met in a field that used to sit where a fire station now stands near Washington High. She was walking home. She half heard him coming up behind her in the tall grass, saying something she did not fully catch. Then he slapped her on the behind and ran. She chased him across Normandy, down 107th to Butland, full speed, not stopping. That was the introduction. In that neighborhood, in that era, a chase like that was almost a form of courtship. Aggression as contact, contact as belonging. It is a small scene, but it captures something essential about how social life worked in that world. You made your presence felt physically. You got chased, or you did the chasing, and somehow out of that friction you built a connection. None of this looks like a gang origin story from the outside. It looks like the ordinary chaos of teenagers moving through a neighborhood in a city that has quietly stopped investing in them. And that is precisely the point. The Crips did not arrive as an alien force. They grew from exactly this soil. From school corridors and front lawns and ditching houses in the back of movie theaters. From kids who knew each other too well to be strangers and not well enough to be safe. By the time the name appeared, the people were already there. The organization just gave the existing human landscape a structure. Bonnie's cousin was the link. She was in class with Tookie Williams at Fremont. He had been transferred from some all-boys school, already known as someone who could not be contained by standard institutional arrangements, already helping other students with their homework while simultaneously doing whatever it was that got students transferred out of schools in that era. The cousin called Bonnie and told her, "I want you to meet this guy. His name is Tookie. He's smart. He helps me with my homework." Bonnie ditched her school and went. Meeting Tookie did not feel like a historical event because historical events never do in the moment. It felt like meeting another boy in a school that she barely attended, introduced by a cousin who vouched for him in a neighborhood that was already full of boys she knew. But something shifted in the days and weeks that followed. The boys who had been loosely connected, Tookie's circle from Fremont, Raymond Washington's crew from the east side, the west side boys Bonnie had grown up around, were beginning to find each other, test each other, feel each other out. And the place where those two worlds most visibly collided, the neutral ground where the collision happened in public, was the Rio Theater. When everything exploded, the Rio Theater was where you went on Sundays. That was the rhythm of it. Not every Sunday, but most Sundays. A gathering point. A place where the same general crowd showed up expecting to find the same general crowd. Where the movie on the screen was almost beside the point, and the real action was in the bathroom, in the lobby, in the parking lot, in the confrontations that broke out when two groups from different blocks occupied the same space and had to figure out in real time what that meant. It was not yet organized in any ideological sense. It was not a meeting. It was a congregation. On one particular Sunday, Bonnie believes it was 1971, though she allows room for error. Raymond Washington came up to the Rio from the east side. She had seen Raymond before, at Fremont, where he used to irritate her by wanting to shadowbox. He was the kind of presence that announced itself before it arrived, the kind of person a room reorganizes around. He brought people with him from the east side, Hatchet Man Craig, others she did not know by name yet, and the energy of that Sunday was different from the usual. Something had already been decided, or was in the process of being decided. The two worlds were not just sharing a theater, they were recognizing each other. Bonnie believes, based on conversations and later reflection, that Tookie and Raymond had already had a more private meeting, possibly that Friday at Washington, before Raymond came to the Rio on Sunday, that the essential agreement had been reached between the two of them before the theater moment made it social and visible. The Rio was not where the Crips were invented. It was where the Crips were announced, at least to the circle of people who would become the first wave of members. You could feel it, she says, in the way people were talking, in the way the conversation kept circling back to the same question of what they were all collectively going to be. That Sunday, Bonnie was watching and listening. She heard the name. She understood what it meant, or at least what it was beginning to mean. And that night, or the following day, something clicked into place in her own mind that she would act on the very next morning. Monday morning, Bonnie gathered girls. She did not call it that. She did not announce it as a revolutionary act or a feminist statement or a power move against male primacy. She went to her garage on 106th Street and told her mother it was a social club. She called her cousin Michelle. She called Ella. She called Renee Berry. There were girls from the east side too. Jackie came with a few of her own. Pam Todd was connected but not present at that first moment. Claudia from over on 94th. Robin, who was James Cunningham's girl. A handful of names and faces occupying the same garage where Bonnie's mother stored whatever mother stored, suddenly given a different purpose. The speed of it is what Bonnie keeps returning to. That's what she says when she tries to describe the birth of the Crips and the Criplettes in the same breath. It was like a wildfire, not an evolution, a wildfire. One week you are cutting school to sit in Blackie's house sniffing glue. The next week there is a name. The week after that the name is everywhere. She describes walking down Imperial. 20 people at the start of the walk. 50 by the time they hit Florence, 100 by the end. The movement did not grow. It detonated. The Criplettes took the same logic and built it in female space. They took the same name, the Crips name, added the feminine suffix, and then asked a simpler and more defiant question than any of them probably articulated at the time. Why should this only apply to boys? The answer the garage meeting produced was that it did not have to. There was no formal vote, no constitution, no hierarchy laid out in a charter. There was a circle of girls who already knew each other, who already orbited the same street world, who had already absorbed everything the boys had absorbed. The neighborhood politics, the codes of respect, the geography of who went where and who owned what, and who now had a name to put on what they collectively were. The East Side girls and the West Side girls found each other without friction in that first moment. Bonnie notes this specifically: no drama, at least not that day. The drama would come later, when leather jackets got taken at a party and one of Pam Todd's girls recognized her own coat on someone's back. That was months out. In the garage on 106th, the morning after the Rio, the Criplettes were simply assembled, named and real. The male Crips, meanwhile, were expanding at a pace that outran anyone's ability to track it. The original West Side core that Bonnie had grown up around, the boys from Henry Clay, from Washington, from the blocks between Normandy and Butland, was now connecting to Raymond's East Side formation, and from those two poles, the network was spreading outward in every direction. You did not join by signing something. You joined by showing up, by your presence being recognized, by the existing members deciding your proximity was a fact rather than an accident. And because the bar to recognition was essentially social rather than institutional, the expansion was frictionless at first. Anyone who wanted to belong badly enough could find a way to belong. That frictionlessness is exactly what made the Criplettes possible. If the Crips had required formal male approval for each new formation, Bonnie's garage meeting might never have produced anything with a name. But the Crips were not that kind of organization. They were a style of street identity that reproduced through proximity and imitation. And the Criplettes reproduced through exactly the same mechanism. Bonnie did not need Tookie's permission to found the Criplettes. She needed her own credibility, her own circle, and the audacity to name what she was doing. She had all three. By the end of 1971, the world that had been building for a decade in South Central had a name and a structure and a momentum that none of its participants fully understood yet. The murders were beginning. The clashes were intensifying. The thing that had started as a social world was sharpening into something harder and more permanent. Bonnie's small formation of girls in a garage on 106th was now part of that larger motion, whether she had fully intended it to be or not. The Criplettes in action. The Criplettes were not a social club. They became one in name only for the benefit of Bonnie's mother in that moment in the garage. In practice, what they became was something the neighborhood already had a word for: active. And active in South Central in 1971 meant participating in the same repertoire of street behavior the boys were engaged in: movement, confrontation, robbery, reputation building through demonstrated willingness to use force. The way the group moved tells you something essential about how they operated. It was never stationary. The Criplettes, like the male Crips around them, were defined by their collective mobility. The fact of moving in numbers, of occupying public space with enough bodies that the space reorganized itself around them. A group of 20 girls walking Imperial Boulevard together is not the same social fact as 20 girls walking individually. The collective body changes what is possible. It changes what can be taken and what cannot be challenged. It changes who looks at whom and who looks away. When the male Crips went walking and the numbers swelled from 20 to 50 to 100 by the time they hit Florence, the Criplettes were part of that larger organism, moving in it, sometimes alongside it, sometimes separately but in parallel, always with the same principle driving the motion: presence is power. On a specific night, the leather jacket scene illustrates the Criplettes' early operational logic better than any abstract description could. Picture it: a party somewhere in Hollywood, months after the garage meeting, the kind of gathering that mixed East and West Side crews in the low-lit neutrality of someone else's living room. The Criplettes who came that night were wearing jackets, leather, a statement in any era, but in early 70s Los Angeles, the kind of garment that said something specific about access and willingness to take. One of the girls Pam Todd had brought to Bonnie's house at some point was at that party. She looked across the room and recognized the jacket on someone's back. Not just similar, her jacket, the one that had been taken during a robbery in Hollywood weeks earlier. She told Pam Todd. Pam told people. The room shifted. That moment was not just a confrontation about stolen property. It was a test of whether the Criplettes would hold their position when challenged on their own accumulation. To back down would have been a signal that what they had taken could be reclaimed, that the taking had not been permanent, that they could be reversed. The street interpreted reversibility as weakness, so the response was not to return the jacket. The response was to hold the position, to let the confrontation develop on Criplette terms, and to make clear that the transfer of property in Hollywood had been a one-way transaction. That logic, acquisition without return, confrontation without retreat, was the operating code of the early Criplettes, just as it was the operating code of the early Crips. It was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. In a world governed by reputation rather than contract, consistency was the only currency that held its value. You demonstrated who you were by what you did and by what you refused to undo. The robberies were not sophisticated operations. They did not require planning in any military sense. What they required was nerve, proximity, and numbers. The willingness to close in on someone who had something you wanted, fast enough and hard enough that resistance became irrational. You identified a target. You moved toward them in enough numbers that retreat became the rational option for the target before they even finished registering what was happening. You took the jacket, the waistline, the jewelry, whatever the particular night's prize was, and then you moved on, together, before the moment could crystallize into something the other person could organize a response around. The targets were not exclusively female, and this detail matters enormously. Covey's synthesis of the Criplettes, drawing on Williams's memoir, is explicit that the group victimized both sexes. This is not incidental. Male gang violence targeting other males had an established logic in the world of 1971 South Central. It was understood as territorial, status-driven, retaliatory. Women attacking men crossed a different line. It unsettled the assumption that females in this world were objects of protection, exploitation, or desire, never threat. A girl who would run up on a boy surround him, take what he had, and walk away without visible fear was making an argument with her body that the streets found difficult to categorize and therefore difficult to dismiss. The Criplettes were not just robbing people. They were rewriting the streets' understanding of what a girl could do, and more importantly, what a girl could make a man feel, which was afraid. The group dynamic was the mechanism. Nobody moved alone. When the Criplettes were together in sufficient numbers, and the numbers grew quickly in those first months, because the name was spreading and girls wanted to be associated with the thing that was growing, they became a different kind of presence than any individual among them could sustain. The collective body absorbed individual fear. The girl who might hesitate alone found that in a group that hesitation dissolved. The girl who moved confidently pulled the less confident forward in her wake. This is not unique to street gangs. It is a human fact about groups under conditions of adrenaline and social pressure. But in this particular context, in 1971, with the Crip name carrying weight it had not carried a year before, the effect was amplified considerably. Inside the group, the social architecture was not rigid. Bonnie was the founder, but she does not describe herself as a commander. The Criplettes were organized less like a military unit and more like a crew, a set of relationships, some older and more trusted than others, without a formal chain of command that anyone had explicitly written down. Jackie was there from the east side, with her own cluster of girls, which meant the Criplettes from their founding carried within them a geographic tension between the west side nucleus and the east side contingent, the same bipolarity that defined the male Crips. It never broke into open internal war, at least not in the founding period, but it meant the group was never quite as unified as its name suggested. It was always, at minimum, two slightly different crews operating under one banner. The West Side girls who grew up with Bonnie on 109th, and the East Side contingent who came through Jackie and Pam Todd, each faction bringing its own relationships, its own neighborhood debts, its own map of friends and enemies. The relationship with the male Crips was structurally complex in ways that resist simple description. Some Criplettes were girlfriends to Crip members. Bonnie herself was Tookie's girlfriend, which made her proximity to the center of power unique among the founding women. That intimacy gave her information, gave her access, gave her a kind of legitimacy in the male world that other Criplettes did not automatically have, but it also created a vulnerability, the risk that the Criplettes would be interpreted as derivative, as the boys' girls playing at something real rather than building something real of their own. And in a street world that reduced women to their relationships with men as a default, the only way to push back against that interpretation was to produce evidence that could not be explained as male-directed. The answer the Criplettes produced to that risk was behavioral. They demonstrated that they were willing to do the things the streets measured. They moved together. They took things. They confronted people. When confrontations escalated, they did not break formation and run, or at least that is what the reputation required. And reputation in gang culture is often the more important half of the reality. Whether every individual Criplette lived up to every moment of that reputation is impossible to say from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that the reputation was real enough to travel. The word Criplette began carrying meaning that was not entirely derivative of Tookie's name or Raymond's name. It began to carry its own weight. The encounter with the Figueroa boys appears in the memoir-derived accounts, primarily through an informal Portuguese translation of Williams's Criplettes chapter that circulates in gang history communities as one of the more dramatic moments in the early Criplet story. This account should be treated as memoir-based allegation rather than fully corroborated history because it flows through memoir reconstruction and translation rather than contemporaneous documentation. With that caveat stated, the broad outline of the account places the Criplettes in direct armed conflict with a rival formation. The women allegedly moved on territory connected to the Figueroa boys. The confrontation escalated and gunfire followed. What the account conveys, regardless of its specific verifiable accuracy, is a street logic that does hold up. Rivalries between the male Crip sets created parallel and sometimes identical tensions in the female world, because the girls' loyalties tracked the boys' alliances with near-perfect fidelity. When the men went to war with a set, the women associated with that set became enemies of the Criplettes. By extension, the female conflict did not have an independent foreign policy. It inherited the same map. The names that survived from the early Criplet circle, Lil Jackie, Black Connie, Pretty Connie, Big Pam, Cookie, Goldie, Bad Bessie, carry the same naming logic as the male Crip world, where physical description, personality, and neighborhood status fused into a street identity that was legible to everyone in the ecosystem. These were not chosen to imitate the boys. They emerged from the same community grammar that produced Monster Cody, Hatchet Man, Crazy D. You got a name because enough people called you that name and it stuck, because it captured something true about you that your given name did not, something the street had witnessed and decided to memorialize. A name like Bad Bessie told you something about what the person had done, or at least what the street believed she was capable of doing. Names like that were not decorative, they were functional. Shorthand for a reputation that preceded you everywhere you went, that meant something to people who had never seen your face, that carried an argument about who you were before you had the chance to make it yourself. The gender dynamics of that reputation building are where the Criplettes' story becomes most revealing. In the male Crip world, a young man's credibility was built through a combination of toughness, loyalty, and willingness to put in work for the set. In the Criplette world, the same general logic applied, but with an additional layer. The women had to prove they were not merely performing for male attention. A girl who fought only when a male Crip was watching, who robbed only when a male Crip was directing the operation, who showed courage only in the presence of male validation. That girl was still an auxiliary in the deep sense, regardless of what name she wore. A girl who moved on her own authority, who initiated rather than followed, who did not need a male presence to justify action. That girl was something the street had less experience with, and therefore something the street found harder to dismiss. Later street narratives about women being used in operational roles, carrying weapons because they drew less police attention, luring rivals to locations where male Crips waited, serving as drivers on missions because a car full of young women attracted less law enforcement scrutiny than a car full of young men, describe a functional sophistication that the early Criplettes were beginning to develop. Whether specific incidents from the memoir tradition happened exactly as described is impossible to confirm. What is beyond dispute is that these tactics made sense in the environment, and that women who were willing to operate that way possessed a form of utility the male sets recognized and valued. That utility gave the Criplettes leverage, a reason for the male world to take them seriously that went beyond social connection and into operational need. The Criplettes, at their most effective, occupied that intersection of independent action and functional cooperation. Female enough to move in spaces men could not. Crip enough to be recognized and backed when recognition mattered. What history left out. Somewhere in the late 1970s, the world that produced the original Criplettes shifted in ways that made the original formation difficult to sustain as a coherent named entity. Tookie Williams was arrested and eventually convicted for 4 murders. Raymond Washington was killed in 1979, shot in an alley on 74th Street. The co-founder of the Crips dead before he turned 30. The mythology already beginning to harden around the absence of the man. The Crips themselves were fracturing into a sprawl of sets that no longer answered to any central authority, if they ever truly had. The loose, decentralized style of power that had made the movement spread so quickly was now creating a kind of terminal fragmentation, every set acting on its own logic. The original alliance dissolving into neighborhood-specific conflicts that sometimes turned the Crips against each other as readily as against outside rivals. The Criplettes did not survive this transition as a single named institution, but they did not simply vanish either. What happened is subtler and ultimately more revealing than a clean ending would be. By the time Sonika Shakur was writing his memoir in the late 1980s and early 1990s, covering his time in the streets from the mid-1970s onward, the word Cripplet appeared in his text as normalized vocabulary, not explained, not qualified, not footnoted. When he describes Tookie in prison having his hair braided by a Cripplet, the assumption is that the reader knows what that means. It had become a common noun rather than a proper name. The original founding event had diffused into an ongoing cultural category, a word for what a female Crip was, available for neighborhood-specific application without institutional continuity from Bonnie's 1971 garage meeting. In gang culture, this is actually a form of success. When the word outlasts the original group, when it becomes structural vocabulary rather than historical reference, the idea has truly embedded itself. By 1998, when a Los Angeles Times feature found a woman named Naomi Bradley willing to reflect on her youth in South Central, she identified herself as having belonged to the Avalon Criplettes, a neighborhood-specific iteration of the same template, attached to a different street, operating independently of any founding circle, still carrying the same essential identity marker. Bradley remembered robbing a girl at gunpoint for a coat at the direction of her boyfriend. She remembered daily marijuana use, neighborhood gunfire, the texture of a life organized around gang affiliation and its daily risks. Her testimony confirms 2 things simultaneously: that the Criplette name had decentralized and localized in exactly the way gang labels do when they survived their founding generation, and that the women who carried the name were still engaged in real violence and real criminality rather than maintaining a ceremonial affiliation. The name was not nostalgia, it was still operational. What happened to Bonnie Quarles specifically is the hardest part of the story to recover, for reasons that are themselves part of the story. Women who pass through gang worlds rarely leave the kind of documentary trace that men do. Men generate arrest records, trial transcripts, prison files, probation documents, newspaper coverage of shootings, and eventually, if they survive long enough and become prominent enough, memoirs, anti-gang activism coverage, and academic case studies. Women generate relational mentions in male-authored texts, scattered journalism, brief appearances in court documents as witnesses or victims rather than perpetrators, and neighborhood memory that dissolves when the neighborhoods themselves change. Bonnie appears in Tookie's memoir as a chapter title and a foundational claim. She appears in Covey's scholarly synthesis as a sentence. She appears in the YouTube interview that forms the basis of much of this account as a woman in her late 60s, articulate and precise, still carrying the same direct quality that comes through in every line of her remembered account. Beyond that, the archive is quiet. That silence is the point. The institutions that documented the Crips' early years, the LAPD, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the local press, the federal agencies that eventually moved against gang leadership, were organized around male threat. Their intelligence gathering was calibrated to identify male gang members, trace male violent incidents, prosecute male criminal enterprises. Women who participated in gang activity were arrested at far lower rates than men for the same behaviors, not because they were behaving better, but because officers were trained to look for male perpetrators, and female involvement often registered as incidental or invisible. This institutional blind spot meant that an organization like the Criplettes could be genuinely dangerous in a neighborhood sense, feared locally, known to the street, while leaving almost no official paper trail that a historian could later recover. The press followed a parallel logic. Gang coverage in 1970s Los Angeles was driven by fear, and the dominant image of fear was male. The occasional girl gang story that did appear was usually framed through novelty, the startling exception to the male default, rather than through any sustained analysis of what female gang organization actually meant for the sociology of South Central. This left the Criplettes in a double bind. Too real to be dismissible in the street world, too female to be legible in the documentary world, the press followed a parallel logic. Gang coverage in 1970s Los Angeles was driven by fear, and the dominant image of fear was male. The Crips became a media archetype almost immediately, a ready-made explanation for urban disorder that editors understood how to headline and audiences understood how to fear. Herbert Covey's research shows cases where the press attributed violence to the Crips without adequate evidentiary basis, because the label had become so culturally available, so narratively efficient, that it filled the space before the facts arrived. That media dynamic was male by default. The frightening thing the city needed to know about was what young black men were doing. Young black women existed in that coverage as peripheral figures. The girlfriend in the background of the photo, the crying mother at the funeral, the occasional lurid exception that proved the male rule. The Criplettes, when they appeared at all in this coverage, fit the exception frame rather than the structural one. There was no sustained investigation into what female gang organization meant for South Central. No long-form journalism asking how women experienced the same neighborhood pressures that produced the male Crip surge. No serious inquiry into whether Bonnie Quarles' founding of a female counterpart told the city something important about what it had produced. Instead, the girls appeared in anecdotes and sentences in the backgrounds of stories about the men. And then they disappeared from the record entirely, which is exactly what happens when you only capture exceptions. They are visible once and then gone, while the structural phenomenon they represent keeps developing off-page. This is why the Bonnie Quarles story has been known in the wrong proportions for 50 years. Street lore often inflates the details. The shootouts become bigger, the lure and ambush schemes more elaborate, the named individuals more mythological, because the oral tradition of gang history has the same relationship to truth that any living tradition does. It protects the parts that generate identity and lets the parts that complicate it blur. Official history, meanwhile, deflates the story to nothing because the people who kept the official records did not consider women worth tracking with the same precision they applied to men. Between those two failures, the overtelling of street lore and the under-recording of institutional history, stands a real woman who did something historically consequential at the exact moment a street movement was taking shape that would define the next half-century of urban policy, policing, hip-hop culture, and American mythology. Bonnie Quarles founded the Criplettes not because she was looking for symbolic importance or historical legacy. She did it for the same reason the young men joined the Crips that same week, because the world around her offered a social form that provided identity, belonging, recognition, and a measure of collective power that individual life in South Central's demolished opportunity landscape did not. She was not performing feminism. She was surviving with the tools available to her, and one of those tools, it turned out, was the ability to organize other women around a shared identity and a shared willingness to act on it. The legacy she left is complicated in the way all honest legacies are complicated. The door the Criplettes opened was not a door to liberation in any stable sense. It was a door into organized street violence for girls who were already living inside tremendous social damage. Girls who had watched sisters overdose, who came from households fractured by migration and poverty and incarceration, who had been failed by schools and labor markets and housing policies that fenced them into neighborhoods the city did not invest in. The gang offered belonging, and belonging has real value. But the gang also offered victimization, and the research is consistent. Affiliation with a gang is associated with greater exposure to violence, not less. The girls who became Criplettes were not lifted out of danger by joining. They stepped deeper into it, trading one kind of vulnerability for another. What changed, and this is the change that matters historically, is that they were no longer invisible within that danger. They were participants. They had a name. The street knew what to call them, and the street's recognition, however brutal the terms on which it was offered, was a form of acknowledgement that had been withheld from women in gang culture for too long. Bonnie Quarles is hard to recover from the archive, not because she was unimportant. She is hard to recover because the archive was not built to preserve what she did, and that failure of the archive is not a clerical error or an oversight waiting to be corrected with a better search engine. It is a structural bias baked into every institution that touched that world. Police, press, academic, political. A bias that treated gang history as male by definition and women as accessories to that definition until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The evidence was never too overwhelming, so the archive stayed quiet. What does not stay quiet is the street's own memory, transmitted through interviews and memoirs and conversations and YouTube videos that preserve a woman in her own words describing a Monday morning 50 years ago when she walked into a garage in South Central and named something that had not existed before she named it. That Monday morning matters, not because what came afterward was good. It was not always good, and for many of the girls involved it was devastating, but because what came afterward was real, and it was female, and it was self-organized, and it arrived at the exact moment when the most mythologized street movement in American urban history was deciding what it was going to be. Think about what that actually means, placed back in its moment. The Crips were not yet a national story in 1971. They were a South Central story, a neighborhood story, an argument between young men about who owned which blocks and what that ownership cost you to maintain. Inside that argument, a woman who had grown up watching her sisters overdose and selling pills at school and ditching class to sniff glue in a friend's kitchen decided that she was not going to be a spectator to the thing forming around her. She gathered the girls she knew, gave the group a name derived from the largest power in her immediate social world, and pointed it outward. The scale was small, the audacity was not. The Criplettes were part of that decision. The street knew it then. The history should know it now. This was not simply the story of a female gang. It was the moment when a woman stood in a garage in Los Angeles, gathered other women around her, and permanently altered the answer to the question, who do the streets belong to? The answer, from that Monday morning forward, was no longer exclusively male. It had never needed to be. Bonnie Quarles just made that impossible to ignore. And then history, doing what history does to women who act without permission, tried its best to look away.